Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to begin part 2 of this Philip Rieff conversation. I should say I was curious during the break to see if there was anything on Twitter about Philip Rieff. And not only is there something about Philip Rieff on Twitter, someone has put together an account with just Rieff quotes, and it has as his picture, might be hard to see, but Philip Rieff in a bowler hat, pinstripe Savile Row suit, so the kind of echt Philip Rieff dress, sartorial dress, and it's filled with quotes from Philip Rieff. I'll just read the first. The first thing worth knowing, though not the last, is that we are, as Pascal said, miserable. So there's a little Adorno in that, David, I would assume.
I love the Adorno of minimum moralia. The rest of it, I'm not so sure about.
I do too. Okay, I've written to Elizabeth Lash Quinn, who I hope and expect is still listening, that at any moment she should just chime in, and we will turn to her immediately. So I just wanted to make that point. And now we have the good fortune of turning to Jerry Mueller, who's going to take us from the biographical to the more categorical in terms of Philip Rieff's own themes.
Okay, so I am going to leave out the biographical and leave out the contemporary relevance and just try to present the essence of Rieff's key concepts. So, and I'm going to try to do it above all in terms of his vocabulary. So his fundamental assumption is that individuals require psychic stabilization. That's not his term, but he tells us that when they don't have that, they're prone to anxiety and purposelessness. The way that people get out of that anxiety and purposelessness is through what he calls culture. And culture has to do with the direction of desire. The direction of desire, or the channeling of desire, to social purposes, purposes beyond the self. It occurs, he thinks, in a hierarchical form. His term for it is the vertical in authority. And he says culture, in that sense, is made up of 3 sort of fundamental factors. There are thou shalt nots, or what he calls interdicts, things that the culture teaches you, if it's a functioning culture, that you're not allowed to do, or that you should feel guilty for doing. And those things that you're not allowed to do are transgressions. Now, he says every culture has to deal with the fact that most people can't live up all the time to what they're supposed to do, to the highest elements, the highest aspirations of their culture. And so each culture has some system of remissions, of dealing with the fact that people have to make good on the transgressions that they've undergone. It could be through concepts in Judaism like tshuva or penance and so on. So you have interdicts, transgressions of those, and highest ideals and remissions. Now, a functioning culture, Rieff says, which does channel desires to social purposes, provides 2 very important things. It provides personal stability, in the sense of, to use a term that he doesn't use, but it's an older term, people have character. That is to say, they have traits that that you can rely upon. First of all, they have a sense of who they are and how that is related to others and to larger social purposes. And you can rely upon them because you know that they have this sense of what ought not to be done, what ought to be done, what ought not to be done, and they feel guilty when they don't do what ought to be done. And because of that, you can usually rely upon them. And in that sense, culture, in the sense in which he's talking about it, he says, is the basis of social trust. Right? And the people who articulate these cultural ideals are what he sometimes calls teachers. Sometimes in his later work, he uses the term officers. They are essentially the articulators of the creed, of what things you should do, what things you shouldn't do, and what are the remissions through which you can make good when you've transgressed. And all of this is based, he says, on each culture having some conception of what he calls sacred order, a problematic term that no doubt we'll return to. And it's related to the notion of what he calls God terms. God terms are sort of ultimate foundations, which are not rationally demonstrable, but which form the taken for granted assumptions of well-functioning cultures. Okay? So, now, he says much of modern culture, it has its antecedents, going back to St. Paul, really, but he's mostly focused on the 19th and then even more so on the 20th century. Much of modern culture, by which he means primarily, or at least in the first instance, high culture, in the sense of the arts, the humanities, and so on, is based not on the notion that people are teachers of some hierarchical culture, but rather it's a culture of critique, or what he sometimes in his later work he calls the third world culture. One of the ways he puts it is, and this culture of critique, institutionalized now, by now I mean when he did fellow teachers in the universities, is a critique of existing communities and their sense of sacred order, their sense of what's highest, their sense of why repression is necessary and why guilt is a good thing. Right? So the culture of critique is a critique of all of that. As Rieff puts it at one point, it's a struggle of Smartlichkeit versus Menschlichkeit. Right? So if it's this firm sense of personal identity that is formed by a culture that leads you to have, that directs your desires to social purposes, much of modern high culture, art, social criticism, and so on, is an attempt to deflate those ideas, to insist that repression is unnecessary and that guilt is a bad thing. And he thinks that since the existence of a internalized set of social demands creates people who are menschlich, that is, who are human in a positive sense, that much of the culture that's actually being taught to them in universities is at odds with that, is an attempt to disabuse them of the various cultures of authority from which they've come. He has a sort of macro-historical conception that there are various stages. It's kind of a University of Chicago great books conception of, stylized conception of the past, that at one time the high culture was a political culture. He's thinking of like the ancient polis and so on. then it was a religious culture, then it was, so he talks about political man, followed by a religious culture, religious man, followed by an economic culture of more economically oriented individuals, followed by the latest stage of what he first called the therapeutic, first he called psychological man, and then called the therapeutic. And Freud, for him, for Rieff, was a transitional figure in all of this, who taught, whose most important message in terms of these cultural transitions was to teach the irrationality of guilt. In other words, the superego is more or less synonymous with what used to be called conscience. But for Freud, the superego is irrational. And so we ought to feel less, therapy is supposed to teach us to feel less guilty for things. And so the final stage is what he called the therapeutic, by which he meant at first in the narrow sense, psychotherapy, but in a much broader sense, a culture in which individuals being unattached from social purposes look to see as their highest ideal their own sort of mental and psychological well-being, unattached from political ideals or religious ideals or what have you. I think those are the major terms.
Yeah, that's right.
Great. Thank you, Jerry. I'd like to obviously have this opened up for comments and other interventions. Can I just ask one question, Jerry? I don't know if you have an answer to this, perhaps someone else does. You know, Giambattista Vico had a very similar set of developmental ideas to Rieff. You know if Rieff had any association with Vico's writings? Because there is certainly an interesting symmetry there.
Yeah, so my working assumption is that Rieff knew almost everything in intellectual history. I mean, when you read his first book on Freud, it's really Freud in the setting of the intellectual history of the West, and it was published when he was 37. It's remarkably erudite. So I think he probably had some sense of it, but I don't think that Vico was an important influence on him. Someone who brought that up in connection with Rieff is in that collection on fellow teachers that you guys edited. Norman O. Brown brings it up as a parallel, but Vico's. But lots of people have theories, stylized theories of historical stages, and so I don't think that Vico was particularly important for Rieff.
Great.
Could be wrong.
So Alan, David, Yvonne, and then Bob.
If I could just build a bit on what Jerry just spoke about. I think it's important to understand that Rieff's concepts evolved. So, for instance, the use of the term God terms, if you look at, The Mind of the Moralist, he takes the term God term from Kenneth Burke, and he refers to Freud's God term as the unconscious. But as he develops, increasingly the term God term is I think, narrowed. Or to refer back to Norman Brown's piece that Jerry just referred to. Norman Brown in that piece, as I recall, talks about how Rieff has suddenly discovered the sacred, or something to that effect. If you look at Trying the Therapeutic, there are very few references to the sacred. He talks primarily in terms of controls and releases. He uses the term interdicts and remissions some, but it's only later, I think, that he really starts to regularly use the terms interdicts, remissions, transgressions. There's an important transitional article, they call it Toward a Theory of Culture, written sometime in the late 60s, early 70s. It's in Jonathan Ember's The Feeling Intellect. So,
But it's also in the Triumph of the Therapeutic, that chapter.
yes.
Yeah.
Well, there's another version that's called Toward a Theory of Culture, which covers much of the same ground. I think it's important to understand that Jerry's synopsis is excellent, but I think that there's, he slowly came to these formulations. Same thing with his references to the officer class. In Triumph of the Therapeutic, he talks about cultural elites. That's the language he uses. So.
Great,
His
thank.
jargon became increasingly difficult to understand and more obscure. And there is a line in Triumph of the Therapeutic where he says, jargon is a curse,
Right.
which is ironic in view of how he wrote progressively later on. Like, some of it is incomprehensible because of the
David?
Yeah, Jerry raised something that I should have thought to raise, but was too thick to have done at the time, which is how much my father's vision of the world was the great book's vision. There's no Brodel, there's no material life, there's no, there's not the notion that these ideas, including changes in theology, might be materially, if you look at the church in Latin America, for example, none of that exists. It's the pure University of Chicago, contrast, Euripides and D.H. Lawrence's view of the good life. And, it's okay to do that. And of course, that was a very powerful idea popularized by Mortimer Adler, in the actual Great Book series. But, it does allow you to make claims that if you were more, anchored in material reality, you might not be able to make, or indeed the material underpinnings of transformations of faith, for example. There's no, yes, he uses, of course he ended up in this position, as I said in my little presentation, of, having decided that there was this language that people would have to, that he was going to use all these words in ways they're not conventionally used. Again, like Lacan, like others. But it's a bit more than that, remember, because it does mean that Chicago view of the world does mean that ideas kind of appear. They don't have an integument, a material integument. And I do think that's a key to that view, that's why all these stages can be claimed. The Eurocentric stuff should be obvious and is clearly evident. For example, his ideas of romantic love are entirely innocent of the Asian experience. Just to give you an obvious other, cultural idea, and even the idea, the erotics are the erotics of 19th century bourgeois Europe in its pretensions. They're not even in European terms. They don't. The way people thought about these things in 1540 was rather different. So one has to be, I think, and that I do again think of as this Chicago, which allows you to theorize to a considerable extent, which I think he did on the basis of his own intuitions.
Yvonne?
But Jerry wanted just...
Oh, I'm sorry.
Just a small comment, David. I agree with the thrust of what you said, and that, it's a very intellectualist conception of both history and of the present. And yet what's remarkable to me is how often he had, actual insights into contemporary culture that were based on intuitions schooled by social theory, but without kind of demonstrably empirical grounding. So.
I have much more of a question. As I said, it's kind of very much from outside, because when I was reading it, and I said this to David, for me, some certain type of parallels with René Girard were obvious on the level of the intuition of this and that. And I'm first interested to what extent they knew each other. I mean, they have been reading each other, they have been corresponding here and there. But also what is interesting for me is that while Girard is perceived as much more kind of religious in a proper sense, for him the real breaking point was not the secular age. The breaking point was understanding that the scapegoat is innocent. Mm-hmm. Christianity was the one that was the radical. In a certain way, all the things that we are seeing is very much rooted in Christianity itself. It is not that you can go back there, because you remember his major story of the sacred and so on. There is a crisis of society. They come up with a scapegoat and they reconstitute. And then comes Christianity and said, but the scapegoat is innocent. Jesus is innocent. And I'm saying this because this goes very much with the idea of irrationality of guilt. So I'm very much interested to what extent basically there was there, and of course, just as a last point, of course, Girard in public life is just the opposite to what David was saying, that he didn't want to influence. Girard wanted to influence. He influenced a lot, and he influenced different people. I mean, by the way, he was very popular with the nuclear strategists when he was in Stanford. Peter Thiel is something different now, but even back then in the 1980s. So is there a dialogue between these two? Is there any references to Thiel or in Thiel towards, not Thiel, but I'm sorry, to Girard?
Alan?
I'm not aware of references. They may be there, but there are other obvious parallels. And specifically, I would draw attention to Deceit, Desire in the novel, where clearly there's an important distinction made between external and internal mediators. That, to me, corresponds very much with Rieff's notion of cultural elites. The cultural elites are, would define external mediation, and what we have with the rise of psychological man is the rise of internal mediation, I think.
Jerry, do you know of any associations with René Girard?
To the best of my knowledge, they didn't know of one another.
Yeah. Bob?
Yeah, I wanted to note that there are substantial tensions and conflicts in Rieff's work when it comes to the return of the gods, the viability of a return to anything like the sacred. In Vico, and this is Norman O'Brien cites this very clearly. In Vico, the return of the gods is inevitable. Philip didn't regard the return of the gods as inevitable. He regards
So that for Vico, after the barbarism stage, you return to the God stage.
return to the God stage, and then there'll be a continuous recycling. And Philip never believed that this was inevitable. He believed it was essential. And in some ways, I think that fact was at the root of his vehemence, his increasing insistence upon what had to happen. What had to happen was, in effect, a return of a creedal discipline that was not open to disputation of any kind. And this is an extraordinary, marked an extraordinary turn in Philip's thinking. You don't see any aspect of that, so far as I can tell. I taught Philip's early work for 40 years in my graduate courses at the New School. No one ever noted that there was any sense in Philip that number one, that this was inevitable, this return of the sacred was inevitable, and number two, that in those early works, that it could be coerced, it could be forced. from the top down, in a culture of authority. And that sense of things began to evolve in an extraordinary way. You see marks of it in fellow teachers, and then in the posthumous works you see much more of that. You see references there to the past in a very undifferentiated way. You don't say, which past? Which past exactly is the seat of that sort of sacred authority, that order? It's not really specified in those writings. When Philip speaks about the law, he doesn't, it's which law? Which laws? Which set of laws precisely? And and that's, I think, one of the sort of problematic features of Philip's thought as it developed, and something that that's worth talking about, because I think it's important to those of us who see something significant here.
Can I just say one thing in terms of the laws? Philip Rieff saw Moses, the creator of the Ten Commandments, as a proper sort of interdictory figure, and was much more attracted to that part of Moses than the social movement Moses of taking the Israelites out of bondage in Egypt. Yeah, Aaron, please.
One of the tapes that I didn't bring touches precisely on this question, and it quotes page 47 in Fellow Teachers, where he talks about the impossibility of the return of presiding presences, what he calls presiding presences. These would be figures of moral authority who serve as examples for the rest of us to learn from. And he believed that in the past, in previous cultures, each one had presiding presences. Jesus would be the paradigm. But we've eliminated the possibility of that ever happening, because in a therapeutic culture, there can no longer be a presiding presence. So he didn't think that there could ever come a time when there could be a return of authoritative moral figures, precisely because of the emergence of a culture which had no respect for moral authority, felt no inhibitions, the interdictions were eliminated. So he definitely talks about that at some length.
Jerry, Rod, and David?
So when I was rereading Rieff this time, I was struck by the fact that he's very good to think with. That is to say, even when he makes assertions that one might not agree with or think are not fully plausible, he can help you to appreciate things differently. So one of the things that I was struck by in rereading The Triumph of the Therapeutic this time is how useful it is for understanding a lot of good things about liberal societies, as well as some of their drawbacks. So for example, towards the end of the book, he talks about America as a society of affluence and less scarcity, and hence one that perhaps has less need of the social controls of the past. I think there's a lot to that. Affluence and the absence of scarcity, it doesn't mean that one doesn't need social controls, but one doesn't need as many or quite the same kind. So that's where this kind of, to get back to my response to David, that's where this sort of empirical aspect comes into it, sub rosa, as it were, or where he talks about liberal society as based on a polytheism of values, which recalled for me a phrase from this interesting German liberal conservative intellectual, Odo Marquardt, who also speaks about liberal societies as polytheistic in the sense that, in two senses. And Rieff refers to each of these, not in these terms, but first of all, that there's a plurality of worlds or subcultures. There's There's the various sciences, there's the various humanities, there's the world of sports, there's the 20,000 subdivisions of the economy, each of which has its own internal hierarchy of values, but which mitigates against there being a single coherent culture in the society. In many ways, that's a good thing about liberal society. Secondly, and again, Rieff alludes to this, pluralism in the religious and cultural sense. When you have a plural society, a pluralistic society, as Peter Berger pointed out, you always have the possibility of cultural contamination, in that people who come from different backgrounds with their own conceptions of sacred order see that there are other ways of living, and it turns out those other people aren't so bad. And that leads you to question the previously unquestioned or taken for granted premises of your own subculture. So then the interesting, then the question for me, I think that comes out of Rieff is whether a liberal society with a polytheistic set of values is a society of no values, which is sort of the claim that he's making, and which actually can very much be the case. But you can also have people living in a variety of subcultures, each with their own internal set of values. So again, I'm the last one to think that conservatism is necessarily dark or whatever, but there's a lot of insights here from a kind of deep conservative perspective about the nature of liberal societies. And one can have a case of analytic convergence and evaluative divergence. In other words, you can say he's right about some of this analysis, and yet some of these things are arguably and perhaps demonstrably good things.
Rod?
I know we'll get into it in a little more granular detail this afternoon, but it strikes me, one of the things that has been most striking to me about Philip Rieff is how tragic he was. He was a man who knew that a world without God, in other words, without an authority, was a world that was inevitably going to dissolve, it seems to me. And yet he couldn't believe in God, and as you say, believe that we couldn't have an authoritative figure come back again. I wonder, though, if that's really true. And I'll tell you why I ask. I'm working on a book now about re-enchantment. And what in the Weberian sense, and what I've found to my shock as a middle-aged person is that among the young, they're becoming re-enchanted, though not by traditional religion. I'll give you an example. I was in Oxford a couple of years ago and met a 27-year-old Anglican ordinand, seminarian, who said to me that before he went to seminary, he had worked in advertising at a very high level in London. He said, I was the only Christian in the office. I said, well, that's not surprising. It's London, 21st century advertising. He said, yes, but there were no atheists there either. Every single person in the office was, to one degree or the other, a follower of a cult religion. He said there were even 2 open Satanists who described being Satanist as living out your fullest human potential. And the young man went on to say to me, he said that the new atheism in my generation, again, 27, is completely dead. But what has followed it is not a return to the old gods. What has followed it is a more esoteric version of what Robert Bellah called Sheilaism, the sort of bricolage approach to religion. So what interests me is in trying to anticipate what's coming next and trying to use Philip Rieff as a jumping off point is what kind of authority might yet be asserted, even though theoretically it shouldn't be able to be. But I mean, people can't live in chaos forever. And when I look at, and we'll get into this afternoon, but when I look at the woke movement, I see that I understand it more in terms of a post-Rieff form of politicized religion, where authority is being asserted, but it's strictly a matter of power.
Thanks, Rod. David?
Yeah, I was just one short observation, which is simply that not all the language that seems esoteric is esoteric. And somebody raised, I think, Alan, this use of the word officer class. And I actually don't think that's an obscurantist. I think a lot of his terminology is completely obscurantist. I mean, for example, using third world when it has such an overwhelming connotation when he used it is just, just saying to people, fuck off, to be blunt. It's not. It's just saying I can do what I like and you just have to follow, or too bad for you. But officer class isn't, because in my view, the fact that faith wasn't going to be reimposed made the military image very appealing to him. Because in the Army, after all, you do what you're told. It doesn't matter what you think or what your opinions are. I mean, there's a story. I remember meeting one of the Tuskegee Airmen when I was young, and he told me that in one of the things black officers did with racist white subordinates was simply to hang their uniform jacket on a thing and say, "Salute the damn jacket." In other words, it doesn't matter what you think of me. I'm your superior officer. And I think, I was very moving and complicated story, of course, that they all had something to say, to put it mildly. But I think that's what he thought, basically. I think the officer class idea is the last place to hope for something in precisely the sense that the military impose on the world, on all members of the services.
So Susan, you have a two-finger, Bob?
Yeah, I want to.
Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say that the term, I agree with David, the officer class, it's not an obscure term in Rieff as it's used. I agree. I think it comes essentially from Kafka's In the Penal Colony. That's where I think Rieff first discussed it in our classes built around that work. And there, the officer, who is the emblem of the officer class in that work, is a tragic figure, to use that term, is a tragic figure in the sense that he wishes to uphold the authority and the set of obligations associated with it in the context of a culture that is no longer viable. And so what he's reduced to is to demonstrating the efficacy of a remarkable apparatus which is set up to torture and punish people as a way of sort of deeply investing them with an understanding of what is not to be done. And so I think in that sense, the term is on the one hand well chosen. It has an origin. I think it's also in some ways an unfortunate indication of the direction of Philip's thinking. To move from teacher to officer, right, is, in my view, an unfortunate move. The conception of authority associated with the role of the teacher and the conception of authority associated with an officer who operates in a context where punishment is central, right, to the meaning of the interdicts, that's a huge jump, a huge leap.
Susan, Tyler, and Alan, please.
Yeah, I want to try to formulate a question that I know we're not going to answer now, but I hope we might put it on the agenda for the afternoon. With all serious due respect for David's suggestion that we not get into the psychological, there's a question that's almost psychological, but not standardly. Rod just talked about Rieff and his work as a tragic figure. Lenny read that wonderful quote, which I know. What what did he say was absolutely right? That we are fundamentally miserable. And, you know, if you go through the triumph of the therapeutic, there are lots of things, I agree with Jerry, that are very good to think with, but the general conclusion is pretty close to, you know, die Welt ist arm, der Mensch ist schlecht, natürlich habe ich leider recht. You know, for those of us who aren't German speakers, I mean, you know, life sucks and then you die. And what we're fundamentally looking for is consolation. Now, again, without asking questions about any particular events in this man's life, I was remembering the exchange between Rousseau and Voltaire, where Rousseau writes to Voltaire, and I wish I remembered it verbatim, but it's basically, you have every reason in the world to, you know, rejoice in the world that you live in. I don't. What's the difference between us, okay? And so there's a question of, it's, you know, what premise do you start from when you try to analyze a particular culture? Do you start from this kind of, pessimism is too cheap a word even to use, okay? If that's what you, pardon?
Too cheerful.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
Thank you, you know. If you start there, there's a smallish range of places that you can arrive at, some more interestingly and brilliantly, and some less so. I'm just wondering if it's ever possible to talk about, I haven't found a way, but this might be an occasion, you know, what is that starting point? Without saying, you know, you had a nice mother who gave you enough, you know, nurturing or something. That would be one way of looking at it that I don't want to look at. It certainly, of course, wasn't true for Rousseau.
Thank you, Susan. Two-finger Misha.
Yeah, I just got a question for David. David, what was Philip Reeff's mother tongue?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think
Little Yiddish?
there was a little Yiddish in English. I think it was a sort of patois, more in the home. And then as quickly as, you know, he could get out of the home. And he didn't, he later, I mean, this was not uncommon. Maybe it's not uncommon for all of us, but, you know, he was much more pious about his parents after they were gone than
Most
he
of us
was
are.
when they were around. I mean, Irving Howe, as Philip Roth once observed, caustically wrote World of Our Fathers after his father was dead. And, you know, so, yeah, it would have been some kind of mix that he would then have rejected. I never heard him use any, you know, Yiddish, but then I'm not, you know, it's not my world, so I don't use those terms myself, and I'm unlikely.
You know, Irving Howe was presenting World of Our Fathers to a student audience at Brandeis, and a student got up to ask a question and said, why did you name the book World of Our Fathers and not World of Our Fathers and Mothers? To which Howe replied, World of Our Fathers is a title, World of Our Fathers and Mothers is a speech. Please, Tyler.
So I just wanted to sort of really quickly connect the sort of pessimism question that's been raised, also to what Rod had talked about with sort of wokeness and reenchantment and identity politics, but also 1968. You know, I've been thinking about Lacan in 1968, and I've been hearing a lot of resonances with Lacan and Rieff based on what people are saying that are really interesting to me as somebody who's spent a lot of time thinking about Lacan. And in 68, the revolutionaries come to Lacan, and they ask him what he thinks, right? And Lacan has this whole thing about the master's discourse and that everyone always speaks in the language of authority and so on. And they come and they ask him what he thinks about, you know, 68, and Lacan says, I think all you seek is another master, you know? And so I think Lacan assumed in a way that is pessimistic, but different from Rieff's pessimism, that authority in some way always reconstitutes itself, you know, and that the interdicts and the guilt comes back. And I think just to foreshadow to later this afternoon and what Rob is talking about, I think we see that even the presiding authorities, I mean, I think we see that on both sides of the political spectrum, with Trump on the one hand, and then people like Ibram X. Kendi, now disgraced, on the other hand. And I think, guilt and interdicts have also come back in various ways. I mean, a lot of what we spend time complaining about is, for lack of a better word, so-called cancel culture and what you can or cannot say, right? And so I think, and perhaps, I guess I'm sort of interested in what the atmosphere would have been like for Rieff after '68, and perhaps those reconstitutions have not happened yet, and maybe they're long in coming and are just now arriving. But it seems to me that guilt is very much back on the table, and interdicts are very much back on the table, and that they're back on the table in an enchanted way, to Rod's point, which I think is apparent to anybody who's spent time talking to folks who have drank the full Kool-Aid. And so, yeah, that is to say, I think there's a really interesting question about pessimism and the sort of return of a kind of authority in a way.
Yeah, and we're going to definitely dig into that this afternoon, Tyler. One often forgets that the so-called Kool-Aid that was distributed by Jim Jones killed you. We've changed it in the vernacular now to be getting on the bus. But it actually was to kill you. But yes, please, Alan.
Two brief comments. First of all, with reference to the officer class, I pick up on David's and Robert's comments. I think it's important to understand that I agree completely that Rieff took that term from Kafka. But in Rieff's interpretation of Kafka's in the penal colony, this is the last officer of sacred order, and that's what's important. He's the last officer, and therefore sacred order is turned completely penal and nothing else. Second point, to pick up on something that Taylor made reference to a moment ago, concerning the renaissance of guilt. In Fellow Teachers, Rieff has a few passages where he mentions that there's a possibility for renaissance of guilt, but it was killed off very quickly in the 60s. And he particularly refers to the Civil Rights Movement. He also refers to the Civil Rights Movement under King in the Triumph of Therapeutic. And I think the argument here is, if I can fill it in a bit, that under Martin Luther King, there was a possibility for renaissance of guilt insofar as the interdict of nonviolence could be reimposed. Secondly, he also makes a reference, a really fascinating reference to the Vietnam War. And he talks about the possibility of the Vietnam protests leading to renaissance of guilt, but he says it's failed. It turned remissive and transgressive. So part of his pessimism, I think, comes out of this sense that these efforts have failed. The renaissance of guilt is not going to take place. And as a final comment, I'd say that there are also some important passages in the book that Aaron edited in Charisma. There's an extended discussion toward the end of Henry James' What Maisie Knew. There's also a famous discussion of Keith's letter on soul making. And I don't believe that, well, I have questions about his reading of both of these texts, because he implies that that the interdicts return because of authoritative figures, and yet I'm not convinced that that's in the texts themselves. So that I'll just throw that out, and we can elaborate later.
Just a quick biographical.
Yeah, go ahead, Aaron.
In 1957, Professor Rieff was an editor at Beacon Press, and he conceived the idea that he wanted to publish a series of essays by Gandhi, Nonviolent Resistance, and he wrote a letter to Martin Luther King asking him to write an introduction to this volume of essays by Gandhi. And the letter is available. You can read it in the Martin Luther King archives in Boston. I read the letter, and King said, "I think that's a terrific idea. I'd love to do it, but I'm busy writing a book right now about civil rights in Alabama. But perhaps after that we could meet." And Rieff proposed that King would come to Boston and meet with him and Paul Tillich, and together that they would put out this volume of essays about nonviolent protest.
Wow. Did you know that? David, please.
Yeah, I just, look, there are lots of, I would pick up on what Susan was talking about, which I think is central. There are many kinds of pessimism. I mean, one must be very careful about this. I don't want to talk biographically, although God knows I could explain a lot of things biographically if I was so vulgar. Remember that, there is the pessimism of the person in despair, and then there's the sort of gallant, ironic pessimism of a Cioran or a Beckett. I mean, the officer class or only punishment will do. That's Mestre. That's Mestre's pessimism. That's the only thing that holds society together is the executioner, as Mestre famously says, and I think that's St. Petersburg. But there's another pessimism which just sort of says, which is Beckett's pessimism. Kenner said Beckett's argument was with the Book of Genesis, and that's all quite cheerful. I mean, I remember in Berlin years ago, Beckett directed the cycle of the famous plays. I guess this would have been in the late 70s, early 80s, something like that. I don't remember when Beckett died. And I think the Schaubier, I'm not sure. And what was very clear for those of us who knew the plays, the people like me, by heart, is Beckett thought they were funnier and should last much less time. So, they were about a third shorter and played for laughs. You saw Laurel and Hardy, how central to Beckett Laurel and Hardy were. That's another, pessimist. That, of course, was my father was completely innocent of. His pessimism was sheer despair.
Right.
It was not a sense that, how comic it is that, that there's this, what is Nabokov's phrase, there's this brief explosion of light between the two darknesses. They thought, there's a famous story about Beckett, just to emphasize that kind of thing, and Cioran had it for different reasons, partly as a result of having been political and realized what a mistake he'd made, that he abandoned all political things. But an Irish poet once told me that he'd been walking in the park with Beckett on a beautiful day, and he said, "Isn't it a fantastic day?" And Beckett said, "Yes, very nice." And then the poet said, "Makes you happy to be alive?" And Beckett said, "I wouldn't go that."
Maybe Shayla and then over to Rod. Please, Shayla.
First,
queue as well.
Apologies that I had to do some institutes. This comment may be a little bit on the side, but maybe not. 1968 has become a synecdoche, right? And I'm wondering if we shouldn't really talk about something like the long 68. Because if we talk about the long 68, we do have to begin with the civil rights movement. And maybe we go all the way to the death of the in Berlin of the student Benno Ohnesorg, where they were demonstrating against the Shah. In between is Prague 68. And it's not irrelevant to remember in the context of this institute, because, the crushing of the Prague Spring, as much as the anti-Vietnam War movement, and then the anti-Shah movement in the student, the sense of the complicity of the West with the repressive regimes of the so-called Third World, which is not a concept that I like or I use. But this was also, an international, not to say cosmopolitan, movement that has many, many aspects. And maybe I'm just a little nervous about its being reduced to that to Berkeley. I mean, of course, in Berkeley, there was also the Students for Democratic Society, not just Allen Ginsberg, not just, the woman who took off her bra to shock Adorno. So maybe we should talk about the long 68.
Excellent. Rod, if I may beg your indulgence, I think I heard Elizabeth trying to get in, and I want to make sure she can. Elizabeth?
Doesn't look like it.
Yes, I'm sorry. That would be great, but I don't need to go before anyone, but if I could be in the queue.
No, please, Elizabeth, go ahead.
Okay. In terms of the significance of Rieff, I just wanted to pick up on what one of the themes that David has been mentioning in the conversation in general, the anti-violence theme. It runs through all of his work, and one of the works that I actually like the most is My Life Among the Death Works, which is this beautiful aesthetic criticism. And it's extreme, for sure, but in its extremity, its clarity of mind, it puts this idea forward of any portrayal of the human being in pieces instead of as a whole, or even a portrayal of a human being as a whole, but with a certain profanity, I guess. It has to be carefully, thought about. What is the reason for that? So it's just such a clear, compelling idea for that we should always keep in mind the integrity and wholeness of the human being. And just to add to the other wonderful sort of historical points about the context that he was writing in, I think the 1960s were pivotal, but I think that he came out of the mid-century intellectual milieu, the post-World War II milieu, where in many different fields, whether it was history, sociology, philosophy, politics, etc., theology, the key question had to do with the Holocaust and with authoritarianism and with Stalinism, fascism. So the key question was, how did this happen? And how are we going to make sure it never happens again? And so authority was the theme. Authoritarianism, many in the social movements that erupted after that thought was the fault of authority. And so Philip Rieff's significance is in part coming forward well before many others did and saying that liberation from authority, period, full stop, is not the way to fight authoritarianism or to prevent it happening in the future. So I think that point, and then another about the mid-century intellectual milieu is that the way many people sought to answer the question about what happened was what is sometimes called the character and culture school. And that transcended particular disciplines at the time. And it was, very much what Rieff was coming out of and exercising in his own work, that there's an ideal type that particular cultures yield and are centered on. And he was, as Jerry pointed out, saw transitions from one type to another. And then with the ultimate one, the therapeutic, being the triumph of basically no ideal type and the chaos that would ensue. So, so that was, I think, the anti-liberationism was a thread running through his work, but it was an anti-violence skew on anti-liberation. And that is unique. That's one of the things that keeps him out of any simplistic political placement. The other thing I would say is that his significance is partly related to the rise of a set of critics of the decline of community. And so that was well before the communitarians that he was already saying these kinds of things. But he really, in some ways, was prescient about that line of criticism, the criticism of the individualism and the individual at all costs, the self against society kind of leaning that really came to a head in the student movement as it shifted to a liberation movement, and in the civil rights movement as it shifted to a liberation movement, and women's rights movement as it shifted to a liberation movement, gay rights as it shifted to a liberation movement. So he saw that, and he saw the potential impact of a line of thinking where the individual needs to be liberated at all costs, and then the community just dissolves. So he would be with people who saw the psychic devastation of the collapse of authority, the collapse of community. People like my dad, Christopher Lash, and Alistair McIntyre. Also, the character school that was very much that idea of the ideal types. People like Richard Sennett on character, James Davidson Hunter on the death of character, and then a whole slew of others on what was happening. Why is it so crucial to see the decline of character? So anyway, that's just a couple of things. Other points too, maybe I can flag you down later.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That's fantastic. Rod?
A couple of comments tied together. I really appreciated what Elizabeth had to say about my life, about the death works and what was a death work. It reminded me of a great scene in Tarkovsky's Andrei Rublev, where it comes about midway the film, where the iconographer Andrei Rublev in medieval Russia is kneeling broken in the ruins of a cathedral that has been sacked by the Mongol hordes. And he's seen his own paintings, his own icons burned. He's in total despair. He has a visit from the shade of his mentor, Theophanes, who basically tells him, listen, your role as an artist is to create beauty, to help people live through chaos and misery and suffering. And he takes him over to an unburned icon, which is an image of, in Orthodoxy, of the protecting veil, the Mother of God holding a veil to protect the people. And Theophanes is saying that the artist has to play the role of a priest to bring life to the people in their despair. Maybe Rieff felt the same way about books that are proper works of art that give life. And let's jump from there to ask David and anybody else who knew him personally, what, if anything, gave Philip Rieff joy? What to him spoke of anything transcendent on which we might hope?
Football. He got a lot of joy from watching football.
So let's hold on the hope, perhaps more optimism question for a second, and come back to that. Thank you, Rod. But first, Alan.
To pick up on, I think, a critical point that Elizabeth made, I think it's very important thinking of Rieff in generational terms. And I've often, when I reread in Bluebeard's Castle recently, I immediately thought of Rieff when I read this passage. In this work, Steiner is analyzing, it makes reference to the 30 Years' War from 1915 to 1945. He's talking about the Holocaust, and he says, the very and the tens of millions of lives that were lost. He says, the very business of rational analysis grows unsteady before the enormity of the facts. Consequently, there have been few attempts to relate the dominant phenomena of 20th century barbarism to a more general theory of culture. When I read that, I thought of Philip Rieff. If there is a sociologist of culture out there who's done this, it's Rieff.
Yeah.
So I think it's impossible to underestimate the importance of the Holocaust and the consequences of World War I, World War II, the Great Depression. I think those are tremendously important in understanding his work.
My friend Arnie Eisen, who edited the third volume of this trilogy, has said to me that he feels that anti-Semitism and the Holocaust are actually the central preoccupation and concern of fellow teachers. And the whole discussion about Jew of culture and violence, to pick up what Elizabeth was saying, is very much one of his central concerns in fellow teachers.
And the quintessence of the Jew of culture for him was trilling.
Well, I think originally it's a passage where he brings up the Jew of culture is actually when he's talking about Marx's essay on the Jewish
On the yeah.
and all the anti-Semitic tropes in that essay where the Jew is made to represent capitalism.
Yeah.
And the various ways throughout history that people have tried to eliminate Jewish identity. First Christianity through conversion, then the communist movement through transcending religious identity, and then finally Hitler in genocidal elimination of the existence of the Jewish people. So when he talks about resistance, Jewish resistance, I think the first thing he's thinking about is just the physical fact that Jews have had to resist attempts to eliminate them historically.
Mm-hmm.
And then he goes on, I think, and later in his life he says, and the Jew of culture doesn't have to just be Jews. It crosses creeds. And he says that it's not just Jews who are Jews of culture, and then trilling is an example. But the original discussion is specifically about anti-Semitism.
Right. And it's interesting, speaking about Lev Davidovich Bronstein in his essay on Trotsky, he didn't see Trotsky as much of a Jew. He said outside of his physiognomy, he was a person who was interested in history, nothing to do with being a Jew of culture. David, please.
Yeah, I don't know what I think about that question, but I do think that this notion of the teacher as these elect, that has to do with, I do think there's a relation to that in this idea of chosen people. I mean, it's quite crude, I accept, but I do think that without that sort of template in his head, this idea that there was, if you like, this special caste. Because, listen, he was a person wholly ignorant of the history of most of the world. There was only Europe and North America. And every example, for example, the idea, listen, Steiner, don't get me started on Steiner. As Iberlin said of Steiner, he's a perfect charlatan in both senses of the word perfect. By
the way, Bob Boyers' new book is on Steiner, but
I'm a huge critic. Yes,
Susan
yes, indeed, I think that's some truth to that. But this idea that in what you read, Bluebird's Castle, the idea that these are the great massacres of world history. Excuse me. I mean, hello. I mean, Hannah Arendt, for all her faults, did understand that, the slaughter of the Herero, or the genocide of the Herero, where, that was the whole beginning of it all, and imperialism, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, those are completely absent, both from Steiner's and from my father's. Even they don't even, it doesn't even enter the room. Forget about what is to be done with it. But I do think, I mean, the point more interesting point than just me venting my spleen against George Steiner, is that I do think this notion of the chosen or the elect is key in his work. And I think in his context, it's Jewish. Of course, you could have a Calvinist version of it just as well. I mean, it doesn't require, or Brahmin for that matter. But in his case, I think that's the imaginative model for teachers as this elite.
Can I just ask quickly, Shayla, Philip Rieff was not a particular fan of Hannah Arendt's totalitarianism book. Can you just say a few words why you think that was the case?
I don't know.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
No, please.
I don't know enough of his work to answer that question. All I know is that a lot of people at the University of Chicago wish that she were not there, or she had not been. I mean, the amount of antagonism that this woman generated, I beg your pardon,
Yes.
was because she was a formidable female intellect.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
She had, Jürgen Habermas told me that she was quite arrogant, and that also in her presence, he felt like, he was being shown the chair, etc. But, that there was also that old Yeke authoritarianism that he exuded. I attended some lectures at the New School where Jerome Cohen would come in carrying her back the way the traditional German professor, you would have thought that, there would have been some, well, I don't quite know how to put it, that there would have been some self-consciousness maybe that there wouldn't just be a role reversal as a woman of the traditional German professor. But I was too terrified myself to speak to her personally, so I would just sit and listen to the Kant lectures and listen everybody, shoot off at the mouth. So I cannot answer that question. Does he write about her somewhere?
He does. Alan, you would probably know where.
Yes, the piece is reprinted in The Feeling Intellect. It was a
Okay.
long review he did of the origins. And I think he actually is not all that critical. He says there are many errors in the book. But I think the critical point in terms of his criticism concerns her defense of human rights. She makes it refers back to the rights of man, all this sort of thing, and he finds her references to essentially Enlightenment ideals to be kind of empty.
Bob?
Yeah, I wanted to go back a little bit to this notion of the Jewish culture, particularly as embodied in some way in a figure like Lionel Trilling, who was not in any notable or obvious way Jewish, a person who definitely did not carry his Jewishness on his sleeve. I knew him.
To say the least.
To say the least.
That's a wonderful way of putting it.
Yeah. So he was a Jew of culture in another sense altogether. Had nothing to do with a particularly Jewish sense of the sacred, or for that matter, with a sense of the sacred. But he did embody a certain commitment to the analytic attitude, a term that Rieff uses in connection with Freud. And in that, he had something like the sense of the sacred when he thought about that. Now, if you think about pessimism, right? I mean, David, I think, rightly said pessimism comes in many different forms. If you think of what Rieff does with the analytic attitude in The Triumph of the Therapeutic, you might say he was anything but a pessimist. I just jotted a few. right? And of course, you can spin these the way you like, okay? I spin them one way, okay? Analytic therapies are anti-authoritarian, okay? Freud was nothing more than an intellectual. Knowledge is better if faith is only an escape from knowledge. Freud's was a chill anti-doctrine. Is that pessimistic? I don't think so at all. The Freudian position encouraged us to be, quote, free of pretense. That doesn't seem to me at all pessimistic. It seems to me, if you embraced it, to be sufficient reason for considerable optimism. More modestly, Freud sought to give men the power of insight, which would increase their power to choose. So I can go on with this. I won't. Right? You've got the book.
I've got the book, and I noted a bunch of absolutely diametrically opposed claims. I mean, I think optimism and pessimism are too cheap. We could follow Yvonne and say too cheerful terms with which to have a serious analytic cover. But I
both assume that you know the future.
Precisely, thank you. But there's hope. There's hopeful and hopeless.
Yes.
And I mean, I noted a whole bunch of what I thought was shockingly dark claims. So I mean, I think there's a lot in this book, but checking the ones you like or hate most might not be the way to go about it.
Well, I think one wants to be, I think, fair to Rieff's genuine and deep ambivalence.
Sure.
That was the quality of Rieff's intelligence in The Triumph of the Therapeutic and in The Mind of the Moralist that many of us on the left admired. We understood that underlying Rieff's perspective, there were all sorts of things that were not entirely friendly to people like ourselves, but we felt the ambivalence freshly expressed and sharply outlined was very moving and instructive. We felt that it was, and it was, over a very long period of time, a corrective to a kind of blithe optimism that many of us had about political movements of the late 60s and 70s, to which we belonged. Rieff was the corrective. But that wouldn't have been the case if Rieff had adopted in those early books a line, a clear line. Pessimism, optimism, no. And that wasn't at all what he was about.
No, that's why I formulated my question as fuzzily as I did.
Yeah.
Okay, it is a fuzzy question because I don't think either optimism or pessimism is a serious analytical term, but there's something that some of us are trying to get at.
And I make a suggestion. We're going to have two more interventions from Alan and Aaron, and then we're going to have lunch, have the wonderful opportunity of listening and then discussing Philip Rieff. And I'm going to ask Alan if it's all right, and Rod, with your indulgence, that we come back to this question of homosexuality after the lunch and then move into the present day, if that's okay.
I have two very short quotes.
Okay, go ahead.
I have to read because
Shoot.
of the question about pessimism. In 1980s, after he was retired from the University of Pennsylvania, Professor Rieff gave lectures at the Medical College of Pennsylvania. And I have the transcripts of his lecture notes. And I'll just read very quickly two short quotes from those lectures. First of all, I have spent my life within sociology in a scholarly effort as a theorist to change the direction of sociology. And the second quote is, I always want to be more positive than negative.
You do a very good job.
Alan, please.
I will read one quote from Triumph of the Therapeutic, and this is building on on Robert's point. I too aspire to see clearly like a rifleman with one eye shut. I too aspire to think without assent. This is the ultimate violence to which the modern intellectual is committed. So the question,
Without assent?
I'm sorry?
Aspire to think without assent.
Yes,
Assent.
that's page,
S-S-E.
yeah, page 13.
Yeah.
So the question I'd like to put out for further discussion is this. I think that Philip Rieff rejected the analytic attitude
Yes.
in his later writings.
I agree.
So that's, to me, is a key question.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you so much. We're going to retire to have some lunch. We could bring it back here, and maybe in around 15, 20 minutes, Aaron, we will hope that your tape recorder, that antediluvian instrument,
Marina has a
will
much
work.
better
Oh, yeah, we have a much better one. And we'll listen to Philip Rieff's lecture on charisma from 73.